Introduce Dr. Desmond Patent, who's here to talk to us today. So Dr. Patton is from North Carolina, and he got his master's in social work at University of Michigan, and then got his PhD at University of Chicago. So that's where he's done a lot of research at University in Chicago. So, and now he is on the faculty at Columbia in New York City. So it's great that you guys are all here. It's a happy day for us in Chicago. And so we're here and not downtown. But I want to draw a parallel that I've been thinking about all morning with how to draw the parallel. So here's the parallel. So we're used to being cynical Cubs fans, and now we have a happy, celebratory, anti-cynical event in the city. And I think Dr. Patton's work is also a good fight against cynicism. So when we do a lot of research, sometimes it kind of feels like it's not that relevant to the issues that are going on in the world. And so this is certainly not the case with his research. So I think it's really inspiring and exciting, and he's setting a great example for us of how you can be one of these really smart people in an academic institution, but take all those resources and apply them to making the world a better place. And so, so there you go. So thanks for coming, and help me welcome Dr. Patton.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me, particularly on this amazing day for the city of Chicago. So I really appreciate you all coming. Again, my name is Desmond Patent. I'm on faculty at the School of Social Work at Columbia University. And I'm going to talk to you about some work that I've been up to since graduating from the University of Chicago about 4.5 years ago. So for the past 4 years, I've been studying the link between social media communication and offline violence. That is, I've been studying social media as an environmental context that is apart from and rooted in offline behavior. I've been particularly interested in how we study context and nuance in language that escalates and becomes, in some part, the trigger for offline violence, particularly in urban communities. So the goal for my talk today is to describe social media analysis of Chicago Twitter data set that I've created that stems from the communications of a deceased Chicago young woman who was gang involved and deeply engaged on Twitter. I will describe new approaches developed along with data scientists with the goal of developing a diagnostic tool that aims to detect clusters of language and situations that may lead to offline violence. So most of the conversation today is about process and the qualitative analysis, but I will touch on some of the preliminary natural language processing work. So this work is really motivated by two different spikes in behavior. One in gun violence in Chicago, and the other in social media use by teens. As you all are probably quite well aware, gun violence has remained a hot topic in Chicago and nationally, as some estimates suggest that there has been a 40% spike in homicides in Chicago over the last 2 years. At the same time, young people are spending an enormous amount of time on social media. So what might be the link between these two issues? So I started off this work in 2013 really trying to wrap my head around what is happening online. And so in this first paper called Internet Banging, New Trends in Social Media, Gang Violence, and Masculinity in Hip Hop, I introduced the term Internet Banging, which is, I argue that Internet Banging is a cultural phenomenon that has evolved from increased participation with social media and represents an adaptive structuration or a new and unintended use of existing online social media platforms. We also examine the role of hip hop in the development of internet gaming and highlight the changing roles of both hip hop and computer-mediated communications as social representations of life in violent communities. Next, I look at how young people use Twitter to express distrust of the Chicago Police Department and the use of hashtags and emojis that can be used to make direct threats towards the police. In addition, in this paper, I introduced the use of what I call community experts. So we hired young people from Chicago that are affiliated with various violence prevention programs in the city, and we asked them to translate and to interpret data so that we can have a more accurate understanding of what's actually being said online as opposed to making general assumptions. Next, we looked at how Twitter can be used to cope with the loss of a friend or family member due to violence. Expressions on social media are oftentimes deeply personal and can turn into offline retaliation when the grieving process for an individual who has been killed has been disrespected online. Next, we identified social media communication that mimics gang-like behavior using Andy Papachristos' work from Yale University. So we identified intergroup conflict, reciprocity, and status seeking in social media communication. In addition, we look at the expression of gang violence in form and content that convey the locational possibilities of social media with the use of hashtags and street names and street numbers to demarcate gang lines and boundaries. And then we go back to interviews with violence outreach workers. And what we learned from violence outreach workers here in Chicago is that they believe social media is a useful prevention and intervention tool in their work. However, what we also learned is that many of these organizations do not have the capacity to use technology to bring forth an understanding of what's happening on social media. And so they certainly were very interested in the use of social media, but couldn't wrap their minds around how to actually apply it in their work. In addition, we also learned that it is vastly important to understand the language and context when interpreting social media content. And so there are several theories that help frame this approach to this work. So the contagion of violence tells us that violence clusters much like a communicable disease and is situated in the most vulnerable communities of color where resources are few. So if online content is rooted in offline behavior, to what extent is social media a vector for community violence? We know that socially embedded nature of identity has been recognized by social scientists as a product of social interactions. However, in a network era, in a social media era, those social interactions are rooted in offline context and requires knowledge that context is needed in order to be interpreted. So that means if you follow the code of the street, the ways in which they command respect and posture in the neighborhood may also end up on social media. And because youth are spending so much time online, it may become hard to distinguish offline behavior from online communication, an idea that is known as context collapse. So I've learned a lot about offline behavior and how it influences online communications. And I've kept humans in the loop by using traditional qualitative methods. But if I'm interested in looking at large data sets and understanding behavioral patterns within and across cities, how can we devise an approach that keeps humans in the loop, but is more efficient? And thus the aim of this work is to develop a more efficient automatic coding process that uses natural language processing, or NLP, tools that is informed by qualitative insights of offline conditions and mechanisms that shape urban gang-related violence. However, in order to do this effectively, we needed an approach that really keeps humans in the loop. We need data scientists who can develop algorithms or systems to detect patterns that may emerge from social media data. We need social workers and other health practitioners who have a substantive knowledge of violence and development in neighborhoods to annotate and to qualitatively comb through subsets of social media data to get ground truth or understanding and make meaning of what's actually being said in post. And then we also need, most importantly, community experts to help us translate data and to make sure that we are accurately interpreting how young people are communicating and what they're trying to communicate to us online. And so today I'm going to be talking about Jakira Barnes. I first heard about Jakira because she made headline news nationally and internationally in 2014. One of the things that makes her case particularly unique is that she was a female gang member that was known as a shooter or an assassin within her gang faction. And this particular role is abnormal for young women in gangs. And so she was positioned with a lot of power within and outside of her gang context. In addition, she was quite the Twitter user. She had over 27,000 tweets within a 3-year period and had up to 5,000 followers on Twitter, which actually placed her in the 98th percentile of Twitter users. As you can also see through pictures and images, her positionality is one of power. One of the ideas that she is trying to put across is that she is in a position of power, and this becomes important for understanding how to interpret her tweets as well. And so in this particular paper that I'm going to talk about with you today, we look at a very small set of data. So first what we did is that we wanted to comb through or mine her data. And so we decided to look at 2 time points. First, March 29, 2014, her best friend, Little B, is shot and killed allegedly by the Chicago Police Department. 2 weeks later, April 11th, she is killed by a rival gang, just blocks from where she resided in the Woodlawn neighborhood here on the south side. And so we pulled around 800 tweets from those 2 time periods to deeply examine and to look for the extent to which we could see forms of retaliation or any types of ideas that may help us understand how and why she was killed, or if there are any plans for retaliation because of these deaths. And so we have a unique data set. These 800 tweets are actually a part of a larger data set in which we pulled Jakira's tweets from January 1st, 2014 through April 2014. So the entire data set is around 10,000 tweets. Now, in an era of big data, this is actually quite small, where you can use millions and millions of posts. But we believe that in order to really grapple with contextual understanding, we need to start small, using a more of a thick data approach. And that can help to inform the use of a more big data strategy. We did not have to get IRB approval because all the data that we use is publicly available. So when you sign up for Twitter or Facebook, you're giving up some of your privacy, and your data becomes publicly available. It's quite easy to use, particularly Twitter. However, because of our own ethical standards as social workers, I was particularly interested in making sure that we go through an IRB process, and our IRB was exempt. In addition, all of our data is housed on an Excel spreadsheet. So this just gives you some of the parameters of what our data looks like and how we utilize the data. So our analysis process starts with input from community experts. So what we did was we hired 2 African American young men that live here in Chicago, and we provided them with Excel spreadsheets. And we asked them to do 2 things: to translate the data and to just give us their interpretation of what is happening online. So here you have an example of what the data would look like. And so we have the author, so Type 1 Assassin is Jakira Barnes. And then we have the actual tweet that we wanted our community experts to annotate or to translate for us. And then below is a table that highlights their description of what is happening in these tweets. So for example, the first tweet: me and Crack hit a lick in the split, with profit 50-50. And what we learned from our community expert is that, well, he's with his friend, they went on a mission, and they're splitting the profit half and half. Now, for many of you who work with young people in Chicago, this may be an understanding that you could easily grapple with. But if you want to apply natural language processing tools that have been developed on American Standard English, it would not easily pick up the nuance and understanding of what is happening in this particular post. And so we need to have a very clear understanding of what's happening from young people before we apply an algorithm that says, okay, this is aggressive, or okay, this is threatening. In this process, we also realize that this isn't enough. We need to have more information. We really need to have more information about the offline environmental and situational factors that influence these posts. Young people aren't just going to Twitter and making random posts. They are rooted in their offline identity. And we need to understand more of that when we are labeling data, so that we're not just willy-nilly applying codes and annotating data that could be quite problematic for young people later on. And so the social work team then uses this data and they apply it to their own annotation process. And so here is an example of some of the codes in which we used. Many of these codes were generated from first looking at an initial 50 posts. And so our team came together and we all coded and looked for themes in the social media posts, and then we collectively decided on what those codes should be. So here's an example of those codes. And then we annotate the data. And so here is an example of what an annotation process might look like. And so on my left, you have the author of the tweets. Then you have the actual content. And then you have our labels that we put on the tweet based on what we've learned from our community experts and our own understanding of what's happening in the tweet. Oftentimes we realize that there are multiple interactions happening, and so we can't just label it one thing, as we know individuality and identity is dynamic and interactions are dynamic. And so we tried our best to double and triple code when we could to make sure that we are getting as much context as possible. And so for our process with working with a data science team, we wanted to reduce the data as much as possible so that we can work with main buckets or categories of information so that we can pass that on to our data science team so that they can look for those patterns. And so what we found is that there were at least 3 main patterns of data to consider. We saw many posts that appeared to be related to aggression. We saw many posts that appeared to be related to grief and loss. And what we also realized is that oftentimes the grief and loss posts would come before an aggressive post. And so young people were using Twitter as a space in which to cope with and process the throes of life on the south side of Chicago. And oftentimes through conversations and use of hashtags and emojis, those things became more aggressive. But they did not start there. And then other is a bucket of posts that is just everyday life. To be abundantly clear, young people that live in Chicago are not spending their time talking about violence all day long. They talk about all the things we all talk about in this room, about being happy, about friends, about relationships, about joys, about concerns. This is the main bucket of communication that is happening online. And so, but we are really trying to understand what are the types of and clusters of language that move from general conversation to escalated conversation to now I'm going to pick up a gun. And so this particular work we are focused on aggression, grief, and loss. This particular post is one of interest. Vernon, that's the gun line, Troy, you cross it, you end up on the headlines. Now, what's particularly important about this post is that it's clear that the individual that is disseminating post is talking about a group and an individual. Now, if you read it to yourself a few times, it also has kind of rhyme and rhythm that could be indicative of a rap lyric. And so, perhaps this is just a rap lyric that is not intended to be aggressive. If we were to ask the individual that disseminated the tweet, perhaps it's just a rap lyric. However, for the individual that is on the other side of this, they could perceive this as being more aggressive because of the direct mentioning of gang lines and territories, individuals, and also the use of the angry face and the gun emoji. So what we're trying to think about more in our research is how can we weight things like rap lyrics to think more carefully about their implications. We do not want to just assign a bunch of tweets that could be rap lyrics or as aggressive, because they could just be young people hanging out on the L, going home. The lyric comes on, they're on Twitter, and they post it. So we're trying to really think about how to weight these within our work. And I would love to hear any feedback that you have about that, that you may have about that process for us. Here is an example of grief and loss. Again, Jakira is emoting. So let me just make sure that you understand who I'm talking about. This is the same young woman that I said was known as an assassin or a shooter in her gang. And by the time she was killed, she had allegedly killed or shot up to 20 individuals. But she's also a young person that has experienced the same level of grief and trauma that everyone else has experienced in our community. And this is amplified through the use of emojis. Again, the prayer hand, sad face, these things allow us to get more understanding of the original intent. Again, it's super hard to really get intent because we have to be in someone's head to really fully understand what's happening. But the text and the emojis help us to get a closer, or to have clues to understanding. And then here's an example of other. We also found there's a lot of conversation around money, desire for money, the ways in which one gets money. So we're learning a lot about how the underground economy operates on social media. And oftentimes this can also be a trigger for more escalated conversations as well. And so we bring together a process that has community experts, substantive knowledge, and we also are interested in the biographical information that young people are presenting on their landing page on a social media profile. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are really interested in a more dynamic process that unpacks offline situational indicators that may help us understand how to interpret the data. As such, I developed an approach for digging deeper in social media data, and this process includes identifying offline indicators like grief, trauma, or an affiliation. We look deeper at the social media content to examine mood and tone in posts. the use of emojis and hashtags. And we look at who the author follows and who's following them. We look at clues for affiliation and neighborhood and connections to others. These additional insights are then used to go back to our data and to decode for content that may have been missing in our original interpretations. And so I'm going to walk you through our application of applying DUVA, or the Digital Urban Violence Analysis approach. So in this particular post, we focus on neighborhood conflict that we're able to derive from the post. So let's take this post for example. Jakira writes, "Don't get caught on the 800 block, lame ass, you better take that shit on Stony Spot." In this example, we need to understand why Jakira is directing someone not to be present on 800 block. So we pull things out like 800 block and Stony Spot. What's the significance of these two areas? Based on our research and input from our community experts, we realized that 800 block and Stony Spot represent two distinct gang territories on the south side of Chicago, and that Jakira is directing a group indirectly on how to navigate space based on what she deems is appropriate for them. We then look at the social media content. The biographical information on social media pages provides additional context. Here we see a handle that includes the name Assassin and a sub-handle that suggests that there's no surrender. We get a sense of her perceived positionality, youngest in charge, and a slew of hashtags that we've learned are all acronyms that refer to her gang, her enemies, and what she is willing to do. So this whole page becomes an additional data point for us. And then we go back to the data and we recode the data. Let me show you what that looks like. So now what we have is a table that we developed after applying DUVA. So again, we have the author of the tweet, the content, our original label, and then after applying DUVA, we write in a more descriptive analysis of what's happening. And then we add the collapsed code, either aggression, loss, or other. And so now, when we hand this off to our data science team, they have multiple qualitative points of inference when applying their natural language processing tools for detecting clusters of language that are connected to the three emergent themes that we have told them are important to look for in the data. And so the first part in this NLP process is that our qualitative annotations are given to our data science team. The first step is to develop a part of speech tagger for the language used by Chicago gang-involved youth that can detect patterns in emotionality and language, and then test them against gold standard test domains that I will show you. Come back to that. And so in this particular case, we built a part of speech tagger using qualitative annotations. Using the part of speech tagger, we can identify aggression and loss with 81.5% accuracy. This means that we get the correct part of speech right as intended in the context 81.5% times versus what we get correct using this Stanford tagger, which was developed for American Standard English, or the Carnegie Mellon University tagger, which was built for Twitter. So let's apply this part of speech tagger so we can kind of understand why this is important. I'll have to go back. All right, so let's look at the phrase lame ass. So The part of speech tagger that is trained by Stanford would say, oh, this is in reference to ass. This is how I would interpret this particular post, ass. However, within a deeper contextual understanding, lame ass is actually being used to modify an individual. And so now, the part of speech tagger realizes that lame ass is not about one's ass, but to modify an individual. And so this is an important piece in being able to dissect the language in our posts. Next, our system then automatically classifies posts as aggression or loss using an emotion lexicon, or indicators of mood, translations, and the part of speech tagger. So an F measure is a measure used for accuracy. How well are we doing with recall? So essentially, 62% of the time, we're classifying aggression correctly. So we still have some work to do. But this is why partnerships with violence prevention organizations and community partners like Cure Violence are vastly important to really help us understand when should we actually move on a post. And so we've done some work to think about, well, why is our F measure low? And what we've realized is that a part of it is because of our annotation process. We're really trying to do something that is almost impossible, which is to be inside someone's head as they're writing a social media post. And then we're trying to infer what is the actual intent of that post. And so we're never going to be at 100%, but perhaps we can first get as close as we can to understanding various ways of looking at a post. And then we can study disagreement. Why are we misunderstanding each other? Let's study disagreement. Because perhaps disagreement is one of the mechanisms by which aggression happens online. Oftentimes fights occur because fights occur on social media because we have a disagreement. So perhaps studying our own disagreement in annotation and in perceptions may help us understand differences in agreement online. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So this is some Facebook data that we've looked at. And one of the things that became very clear to us is that our annotators have a different understanding of loss and aggression. So some of our annotators can look at a post and look at a conversation and think, okay, this is really about grieving. And some of our annotators look at the same post and think that it's aggressive or threatening. This is scary because what we are doing is we're perhaps misclassifying where an individual is. So one annotator can look at the post and say, oh, this is really someone bringing us into the grieving process. And so what we want to make sure we do is really understand our interpretations and how this may impact the coding process and how it impacts the NLP tools that we're using as well. Next, this is a really interesting post that focuses on the perception of the audience. So here, a Facebook user says, basically, if you're from Howard, I don't care if you're 65 years or older, we ops. And that means we're opposition. We are opposing each other. Now, one annotator would quickly see this as being aggressive and threatening. But look at the conversation. You better leave old folks alone, nephew. When you look deeper at the conversation, the ways in which individuals are perceiving the post seems to be a bit more jovial. They're not taking it as seriously. And so we have different shifts in tone that become an important part of our annotation process. And so we want to be able to identify that even when the initial post may be deemed aggressive, the ways in which the audience is seeing the post can be vastly different. And we want to make sure we hold both things constant. And so what are our next steps? Well, we are really working hard to work with community-based organizations here in the city to be able to provide them with social media as a data point in their prevention and intervention strategies. And so we are in the process of developing some partnerships with community with Cure Violence here in the city to be able to work with them to provide them with some deep qualitative insights and natural language processing tools that can help them use social media as a data point when intervening in violence in Chicago neighborhoods. And so the idea is we would provide understanding of clusters of language, in this particular case around grief and aggression. We would hand that off to them and say, these are insights that we have found either historically or in real time that you should think about. And we leave it up to them as experts in violence prevention to make decisions around how to move on those particular cases. We do not think that we are the experts in this. These are folks that work day in and day out with folks in the community. We want them to make decisions based on our insights on what's happening on social media. And so again, this is an iterative process where we're going back and forth to the data to make sure that we are evaluating what we're doing, what we're saying, and getting this information to folks on the ground in real time. So some of you may be wondering, well, what's next? Some things that we think are really important is getting ground truth. A question that I'm always asked is, well, does a social media post actually lead to a homicide? Well, there are some things that we need to do in order to be able to solidify that answer. First, we want to be able to see to what extent, when we see spikes in aggressive language online, are we also seeing spikes in homicides in the same areas in which that social media communication is coming from? We can use social network analysis to be able to look at the ways in which communication spread through networks online. And then we can use news media articles to confirm. So we can use things like the Chicago Tribune's homicide tracker to verify when young people are saying when young people are describing situations online, when they are talking about particular events, deaths, things that are going to occur, we also see that particular situation, for example, a homicide, land on the Chicago Tribune's homicide tracker. And then being able to look across platforms. We predominantly use Twitter in our work, but being able to look across platforms, because what we've learned is that when we look at Facebook data, the conversations are a bit more visible and easier to follow. And that helps us understand how mood and language change and evolve from general conversation to more escalated conversation. And then perhaps looking at some comparison groups. So we know that young people on the north side, cyberbullying. The ways in which young people engage social media is no different from if you live on the south side or the north side of Chicago. The difference is context. And so we want to understand to what extent these differences, there are similarities and differences in how young people across the board are using social media. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. Yes.
I'm curious if you have any steps or reasons to not look at Instagram as part of your other platforms.
No, we certainly want to. It's just this is our first step. Twitter is a really easy place to get data. It's probably easier than other platforms, and so that was our first stop. But we definitely believe that Instagram is a hotbed for information, and we want to be able to look for that as well.
But just to note, I think that Instagram is more closely related to Twitter, based on just you have a channel, it's out there, and you can find all kinds of things based on hashtags, unlike something like Facebook that tends to be more of a closed community.
No, that's a really good point.
So a lot of the steps that you're taking to get to work with Twitter may be very similar.
For Instagram, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
This was fascinating. Thank you for sharing.
Thank
I don't use Twitter at all, so I'm curious, the retweet button,
Mm-hmm.
what role does that play in this whole thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, we can think about it from different perspectives. One is that it shows you which types of posts are more important. It shows you who the top communicators are. So if a particular post is reposted 500 times, then it tells you something about the post and it tells you something about the individual. And so we can use that particular function as a way to measure the significance of the post and the individual that is disseminating that post. Yes.
I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
I'm here with two other people from Healing for People Chicago. We provide intensive case management to kids who've been violently injured
Yeah.
and treated at Comer and Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear from my kids about a lot of shootings that don't necessarily result in a homicide.
Mhm.
Sometimes they don't even result in an injury.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love to hear about if you have any ways to include that information. I know they're hard to track if they don't get reported.
Yeah.
And then my second question is whether you've had any interaction or contact with Jakira's family about their work on her.
No, that's a really good point. So for your first point, I think that what we can do is think of it will be hard to figure out ground truth, right? So how could we confirm it? What we can do is see how conversations around. We could look at conversations that may lead to that shooting, and so that is probably easier to find, but being able to verify becomes a challenge. But it's something that we can definitely think more about. It's a really good point. In conversations around Jakira's family, no, we have not, and I really appreciate you raising that question. We think a lot about the ethics of this work, and it's challenging because on one end, we want to be able to provide this information for folks that are working on the ground with young people so that they can have this information in real time. But it may affect their relationship with young people, and it may cause issues around trust and respectability, and so how do we think about that? And honestly, I don't have a full answer on that. I've not had a chance to speak to Jakira's family around this work. One of the challenges with this particular work is that when news articles pick it up, they focus on one aspect of it. She's a gang member, she did this, that, and the other. In my writings and when I talk, I really tried to make sure that people understand that there were all these things that were happening to her, and this high level of grief and trauma and stress that was impacting her life that never gets told. And I really try to tell that story, but that, as you all know, it doesn't make for a sexy topic in the paper. But if you have thoughts around how I can do that, I am very open to that. Yes?
I have two thoughts. One is in the way that you're going back and tracking the Twitter and Facebook accounts, it reminds me of David Clark used to be here and used to do these autopsies on kids who had killed themselves. Mm-hmm. And what he would do then is like psychological autopsies, which in some ways is a little similar, going back and gathering information from all, and it touches on the rest of the family, the rest of the friends, like what's their involvement in perception, which may be another way to get more information in a broader context. The other thing that this reminds me of, like we're all starting to do more work with ACEs and adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care. And that's sort of when you talk about, the newspaper will focus on one aspect, but there's so much more going on. And we see that all the time. So that might be an interesting tool almost to sort of see all the other things that were going on in their lives that put them in a situation of risk.
Yeah, maybe even thinking of it as pros and cons, like the one with the uncle who said, why you beefing on old people? Like, are there things that are, I don't know, that was a sense of humor, I don't know, ways that things get de-escalated, I don't know how you would get the language but.
De-escalation happens all the time. Young people are policing each other. There will be many opportunities and situations where someone will make a post that is deemed aggressive by their peer network, and they will say, take that off, or why are you saying that? That is not uncommon as well, so we definitely weigh that and take that into consideration when thinking about the post.
Are you also able then to create like a linkage between people? Like really putting their social network not in terms of like the platform, but who's related to whom or who's friends with whom and who's.
Yeah, that's actually what we're working on right now. So we're working with some sociologists at Yale to be able to piece together our social networks and then overlay that with social media communication to see to what extent individuals that are embedded in networks of risk where they have been arrested or they've co-offended together, to see to what extent their conversations are connected based on their embeddedness in that network. Yeah.
I'm curious about your community experts and
Yeah.
how you recruited them. And
Yeah.
you paid them, but are they Jakira's age? Were they
Great
from
question.
her neighborhood? Were they affiliated with the same gang?
Yeah, so I worked with the YMCA Violence Prevention Program, and I've worked with the director there for quite some time, and I asked him to help me identify young people that he thinks would be helpful in this particular research study that are close to the same age. So these were two African American young men that are 18. And that come from either the same neighborhood or a similar neighborhood, meaning similar rates of violence and gang activity. And so I relied on someone that works with young people, that understands violence, that understands privacy and identity, to identify people that could be a part of this process. Because one of the things I worry about is having Amber from Chicago looking at a bunch of Twitter data. They either know the individual or they put themselves at risk by being a part of the study. And so I really rely on people that are embedded in communities that have direct relationships with young people to help me make decisions on how to involve them. We also want to make this more of an experience for them, and so as we continue our work, I've hired someone to help me think about, well, what can the young people also get back from this as well, and so not just having them get paid and translate data, but making this more of a research experience that they can use to move forward. Because the young people that we've worked with in the past, they are on the cusp where they can either go back to the game or go to Northwestern. And so it's really that close, so we really want to be able to support them in the way that we possibly can.
So I work for the same organization, and all the youth we work with have been violently injured.
Yeah.
And one of the discussions we always have is around the ethics of kind of getting involved in their social media,
Yeah.
putting ourselves on social media.
Yeah.
It's also, we don't do it, but it would be one of the easiest ways to communicate with our kids because they have their phones off a lot.
Yeah.
So when you were working with the community experts, did anyone talk about their thoughts on maybe ideas of either including it in assessments, talking about their involvement on social media, or doing workshops with the youth on social media? Because we keep talking about it, but we still haven't done anything. So it's pretty much something I avoid in my day-to-day work unless they tell me they've done something on Facebook, and then we kind of dialogue about it.
Yeah, so we only had 2 community experts, so I don't want to speak beyond two people.
Have pure violence.
But those young people thought it was a great idea to look at social media. I mean, the main thing to remember is that, you get this, they spend their lives on social media. Wake up, social media, go to bed, social media. And how can we not think about social media as a part of our work with young people when they may spend more time on social media than they spend with their parents or with their peers? And so to not think about this as an environmental context, I think, omit some really critical dynamics that are playing. And so I don't know where to begin, but I think always beginning with the young people that you're working with and asking them how we can be more involved and having them tell you about the ways in which they think is appropriate for connections. But I think using social media for recruitment is one thing. For recruitment in events or research studies is one dynamic. But looking at social media as a context for understanding young people's behavior is another thing. So I think you would be the expert in understanding how to broach that conversation with them. Yeah.
Going back to kind of the connection between social media and the social networks,
Yeah.
are you also perhaps looking to be able to identify who ops are? Because I think you're fairly certain that right, especially in the Black paradigm, people are no longer like hat to the left,
Right.
hat to the right, hand leg up, hand leg
Right.
down.
Yeah.
And so it's far more difficult to determine like who are your ops, and now people are linking up with different organizations and
Right.
such. So is that kind of what you're interested in gaining with the social network?
Absolutely. And what we learned is that young people are very, I mean, within the text, within the language, so not even the pictures in the videos, it's very clear who ops are. And they leave a lot of clues. And so again, it helps us understand who ops are when they mention street names. Because then you can say, okay, well, we know that, you know, Normal Street is one gang, and when they say they're on Stony, that's another gang. So it may not be readily apparent, but they leave behind these clues that help you understand. One thing that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of those videos when they're in a rival gang territory, and then they one thing that's really popular is to pan to the actual street intersection so that you can see precisely where they are. And that's another additional clue. But yes, we were really interested in understanding who the opposition is. Yeah.
So you got me thinking about the about a range of issues about the ethics of how you engage young people, and the analogy that came to my mind is if you were is the risk of sort of cultural imperialism, you know, of projecting an interpretation that wasn't intended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How would you do that work if you were studying, you know, the HIV trials in Ivory Coast,
Sure.
or Ebola in
Yeah.
Liberia? You would look to the community,
Right.
to offer that interpretation. And the question that came to my mind was the expectation of privacy issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I thought, of course it's exempt, isn't it? Or you know, do people, even though this might be a public-facing communication, do people have a greater expectation of privacy when they're using coded language? You know, if you were encrypting your email, wouldn't that indicate that you had a higher expectation that that communication would remain
Sure.
private?
Yeah.
Between you and the intended
Yeah.
recipient. And so by the use of this coded language, do the folks who are using that language
Yeah.
expect it not to be accessible?
Well, I guess the question becomes, who deems the language coded? And so one could say, for me, it is coded because I don't understand it. And for them, this is the way in which they speak to each other. And so, you know, I think this becomes the challenge oftentimes with this work is that we apply our adult lenses to understanding the ways in which young people are communicating. And what we're learning is that, yes, that there may be aspects of the language that are coded. We have to talk to you to figure that out before we make any assumptions about that. But B, a lot of the ways in which young people communicate and present themselves online is embedded in just normal kind of adolescent development, right? And so, you know, young people have always made bad decisions and done silly things. We all know this. We've all done it ourselves. And it's no different from how young people engage social media. And it doesn't matter where they come from. They're all doing wild things on social media. And so I think one of the things that I think is really important is to think about digital literacy. And oftentimes young people that I am working with or analyzing their social media communication are not in schools where they are learning about, they probably have no idea that A, the police monitor their social media, B, that when they sign up for these accounts that they're no longer private. And I think having that level of understanding could help them think differently about their social media behavior, but at least provides them with some context. So I think that's an important step as well. Yeah.
Hi, I'm from DePaul's Online Technologies Lab, so this is really fascinating to us. We're studying a different hybrid community, the fighting game community.
Yeah.
Which has a lot of online and offline behavior. I had a couple questions for you, but also to your point, there is a study that I read recently about a website that nobody used. Well, nobody over here probably used called Devo. It was like MySpace, but for the UK. And what they found was that a lot of people use the coded language, and they use the website with the expectation and kind of setting it up so that parents and employers don't really understand what's happening on the pages. So I do think that there is some kind of expectation of privacy, even if you know that you're posting it, that anybody can reading it, not everybody can get it, right? So I was actually going to ask a similar question to you in terms of like updating the algorithm or whatever you want to call it, as language changes and also as people shift. You know, when parents and grandparents ended up creating Facebook accounts, everybody migrated to Twitter and now Snapchat and Instagram and all these other things. So as people become aware perhaps that, oh, these groups are monitoring what I'm saying, they are clued in to what I'm doing, I need to change my language or I need to change the platform. Have you thought about that?
Well, you're really making the case for why a human-centered approach is vastly important. And so with using a human-centered approach, you keep them in the loop with having an understanding of the changes in language and the movements and platforms. And so not only are we just observing what's happening on Twitter, but we're talking to young people and saying, okay, well, what platforms are you using and which ones are you using most frequently and why? And where are you spending the most time? And what does this word mean? And, you know, keeping up with them helps us keep up with the algorithm. And so I think that is a really important piece. I think you're right in terms of, I think everyone probably has some expectation of privacy when they're on a social media platform. I wonder to what extent that changes based on platforms. And so on Facebook, the idea originated from, you know, you are connected to people that are in your offline community. So your friends, your classmates, your family, that's deeply embedded in a very concentrated network, versus Twitter, which is really designed to be this public-facing platform. And so the same level of privacy may be different as we move between platforms. And that's an empirical question that I don't know the answer to.
I did have a second question, kind of echoing an earlier question. When I pitched this to my lab for us to come to this, somebody kind of made an offhand comment like, oh, that sounds a lot like Minority Report or something. And I thought then there's an anime called Psychopaths where you're arresting people before they commit crimes and stuff like that based on their possibility of committing those crimes. So I was wondering if you guys have done any thinking about finding a way to prevent it from moving to an intervention or a prevention strategy to one where somebody might want to use it for punitive measures.
Well, it's already used for punitive measures. I'm at Columbia University, and some of the housing sites that are just below my university, 104 black and brown youth were arrested. They have been monitored on Facebook for over 4 to 5 years because of gang chatter, gang conversations. The police here in Chicago are using social media daily to monitor social media interactions that are deemed gang-based, oftentimes based on your affiliation. So if you live in a community that's tightly wound and you are affiliated with each other on Facebook or Twitter, they will monitor everyone that's connected because they assume that you all are connected on some deeper level. So that's already been done. I'm always asked, don't you want this? Don't you want to work with the police? Don't you want this to move to help them? And I'm a social worker, and I'm really interested in preventing violence. I want to work with other community practitioners. I want to work with people that care about young people. That's my goal. I do think that there's potential to create a more holistic way of doing this work that is, in my opinion, more anthropological and brings about an awareness of the root causes of violence. When I started this work, my research question was the wrong one. I was really interested in, well, what key words and phrases are the triggers for offline violence? And when I dug deeper, what I was really seeing was trauma and stress and young people emoting and crying out and really just looking for other people to help them. That's a different thing that we need to really pay attention to. And so that taking an anthropological approach allowed me to understand that more deeply, as opposed to taking a big data approach where I would have only got a bird's eye view of what's happening on the ground.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I think we're